This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 191 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about why transgender athletes should be included in women's sports. My podcasts are usually a few months behind whatever is happening in the news because I work slowly and I try to take great care with every episode. And that is the case with today's topic. With that said, as excited as I am to dig into the topic of trans inclusion in sports, even more recent events compel me to take just a minute to address the gun violence that continues to end so many innocent lives in the U.S. In this case, I am speaking specifically of Buffalo and Uvalde, Texas, but history tells me that by the time you listen to this episode, it's likely that other incidents will have taken place, because they always do. I want to start simply by acknowledging the fear, heartbreak, anger, and despair so many of us are feeling, and the hopelessness, the heavy belief that this may never change. I have no immediate answers, but I believe that anyone who wants to help make things better can do their part by learning more about what other countries have done to reduce gun violence, what gun control advocacy groups are proposing in this country, and how your legislators are voting on these issues. If you're someone who typically avoids politics, I urge you to just dip your toe in the water. People use the term politics to dismiss huge swaths of issues that are literally matters of life and death. And that is precisely why bad things keep happening, because so many of us want to avoid the hard, messy, draining work of plugging into current events, learning a little bit, and giving support to people who are trying to make things better. Educating yourself and supporting the people who are actively working on this problem will not only make you feel less helpless, it will give more energy toward solutions. And whether those solutions are going to be 100% effective doesn't matter. Doing something is so much better than the nothing we've been doing for decades. While you're at it, learn more about the white supremacist roots behind many of these attacks. Although there may not be a connection in every single event, it's behind so many of them that it can't be excluded from any conversation about gun violence in America. Okay, so now I will restart this episode as I originally intended. 2 months ago, your social media may have looked a lot like mine, flooded with images of a swimmer named Lia Thomas, a transgender female athlete who had just won the NCAA championship in the 500-yard freestyle event. Alarmingly, most of the articles shared on my feed were shared by people I knew who were outraged. Outraged that Thomas had been allowed to participate. Outraged that she had won. The most common narrative was that Lia was a biological man who was a mediocre athlete in the men's division and simply decided to be a woman, switched to the women's division, and dominated, robbing the other women of opportunities. Not only is this narrative riddled with inaccurate assumptions, it clearly comes from a place of not actually knowing any trans people or being at all familiar with the long, complex process of gender transition. After the initial swell of fury started to die down, another acquaintance of mine posted her take on the issue. Katie Lever had once been a Division I college track athlete, and now in her doctoral program she studies sports policy, so she truly has an insider's perspective on college-level women's sports. When I read her post, in which she advocates for full inclusion of trans athletes in women's sports, I thought it needed to be read by more people. So I asked if she would write a shorter version for my site. In today's episode, we'll talk through the main points of her post. You might be wondering what this has to do with education, which has always been the main focus of my work here. Although the bulk of what I try to share with you is about the nuts and bolts of our work as educators, the methodology and research behind how people learn, the reality is that so many non-teaching issues impact the people you teach. Some of you are also athletic coaches, so today's episode will be more directly relevant to your work, but many more of you will teach transgender students, whether you live in a place that allows them to express that or not. So many states have either passed or will soon pass bills that directly target these students, introducing even more harm into their lives than they are already dealing with. And if these students have teachers who have a more nuanced education on transgender issues than their legislators do, then you may be able to provide something of a buffer for them, or even work to put more evolved people into office. In short, when a topic like this one comes up in the news, I often picture the people in your lives turning to you and saying, "You're a teacher. What do you think about this?" And I want your opinion to be an informed one. One minor correction about the interview: Leah Thomas is actually a swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania, not Penn State University, as is mentioned in our conversation. Before I play my interview with Katie, I'd like to thank Spindle for sponsoring this episode. Are you looking for a project management tool for the classroom? Spindle helps teachers co-plan and co-learn alongside their students for any type of project. It's designed by teachers to not only capture but optimize a student's workflow, not just their final work. Visit spindle.com, that's SPINNDLE.com, to learn more about giving your students a safe space to manage their own learning. Support also comes from Pear Deck. One of the reasons we love Pear Deck is because it was founded by educators who have designed products to support instructional best practices known to improve student outcomes. Pear Deck gives teachers real-time insight into student thinking and understanding so they can react as necessary and seize teachable moments. Better yet, Pear Deck's seamless integration with Google Slides and Microsoft PowerPoint makes it easy to build interactive presentations that generate 100% student engagement. And here's some great news for you. Pear Deck is offering all of today's listeners 90 days of Pear Deck Premium access for free. Just visit peardeck.com/cultofpedagogy22 to get started. That's peardeck.com/cultofpedagogy22. Now, here's my conversation with Katie Lever about trans athletes in women's sports. So I want to welcome Katie Lever to the podcast. Katie, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
And we actually know each other from a couple of years ago because we did CrossFit together, but we've stayed in touch through social media. And you posted something a couple of weeks ago about the scandal with Leah Thomas and the swimming and the whole thing about female trans athletes. And I really like the way you put it. And I asked if you would please write a post for my site about this, because this is something that is not necessarily directly related to education, but I think it's an opinion that I think I'd like teachers to hear, because I feel like this is a conversation they're going to be involved in a lot of ways. So before we start, tell us just a little bit about sort of your background and why this is something that you're pretty invested in yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a former Division I athlete. You and I met in Bowling Green, Kentucky when I was in grad school, and I ran track and cross country for 5 years at WKU. And I'm now a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas at Austin, and I study NCAA discourse and sports policy. And so a big topic that's come up in my research has been these anti-trans laws and different trans athlete inclusion guidelines. The Leah Thomas discussion has come up in a lot of my conversations with people, and a lot of people want my opinions on it because I'm a former college athlete, and I'm very invested in issues that affect college athletes. And it got to the point where I was having to, people would want these really short, concise answers to this very complicated question of where do trans athletes belong in women's sports? Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't give them a quick answer. And so I wrote an article on my personal website that, is now going to be published on yours, just because I wanted to give people a resource where I could point them to the bigger argument and honestly, the more complex argument, because there are a lot of nuances in this conversation, and it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's a very complex discussion and a very important conversation, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna mention your book too in a little while, but we might as well go ahead and do that now. It's called Surviving the Second Tier. And yes. It's not about trans athletes, but this is still kind of a world that you're in quite a bit. And so what is the book about?
So my book is actually a dystopian novel that is about the issues in the college sports industry that I study, because my research is super policy heavy, and policy is not very exciting for most people. So I want to transform my research and make it accessible and interesting. And, the stakes, I think, of my research are very high because policy failures in the NCAA very directly affect college athletes. And so I want to create a story that people could get really emotionally attached to and to really humanize college athletes in a way that athletes normally aren't, because we tend to reduce them to statistics or salaries or any other numerical value we can attach to them. And so I wanted to just humanize athletes and give people a story that they could grab onto rather than something that they're just reading about in the news.
That's a great idea. So before, you've got sort of 5 key points to sort of support this idea that trans athletes should be welcomed and included in women's sports. But before we get into those, if you could just sort of summarize what the sort of most dominant opposition is to it. What is their argument?
The most common argument against trans athlete inclusion that I hear is these women have spent time in male bodies, and so they have an inherent biological advantage. And there is some merit to that argument because trans women do have a different I guess a different hormonal and chromosomal experience than cisgendered women. But the argument and just athletic performance in general is so much more complicated than just, chromosomes and testosterone and all of the baseline measures that we throw around to try to say this is fair, or this is not fair. And so I wanted to get into the nuance of all of those different areas in my article.
Okay. And, while we're talking, I'm actually thinking about someone I know who's been pretty vocal in my own life about this, who has a daughter who plays a sport. And I think they're hoping for some college work for her in the future. And they've just been like, you know what, I support trans people, but this is where it goes too far. And I feel like for them, it's very difficult to try and understand where the fairness lies and why should they support this. And so you've broken this down pretty seriously. And by the way, for people who haven't heard of Leah Thomas, that name came up a whole lot in the last month. Just tell us quickly who she is, and then we'll get into the points.
Yeah, so Leah Thomas is a trans swimmer for Penn State University. She spent several years of her college career on the men's team before transitioning to the women's team, and she won an NCAA championship. I want to say in the 500 meter. I need to double check that, but she did win an NCAA championship. On the women's side this year. And I believe she placed in another one. And so that generated a ton of controversy because whenever a trans female athlete is successful, people like to attribute that to their trans status alone. And so her name has come up so much in the last couple of months. And she's been very, very politicized as well, I think, by people on both sides of the political aisle. And I'm really seeing I'm seeing her name come up a lot too in these conversations about, these anti-trans sports bills that are affecting young women and girls, children. And so it's been a very emotional issue, a very political issue. And I think it's a problem that's been blown way out of proportion as well.
Okay. So let's start with your first point, your first reason why we should, why trans female athletes should be included in women's sports.
Yeah, so the first point that I address, because a ton of people I'm seeing are addressing a lot of criticism at Leah Thomas herself. And this is something that I have to remind people of all the time when I'm talking about issues in college sports. When we see college athletes, abiding by rules and still maybe getting away with something. I'm seeing this a lot with name, image, and likeness with people who are like, oh, that athlete's making too much money. It's like, no, they're abiding fully by the NCAA's guidelines. So if you have any problem with college athletes making money, take it up with the NCAA. Don't take it up with the athlete for following the rules. And I think it's the same thing with Leah Thomas. You can agree or disagree that the NCAA is doing the right thing, but at the end of the day, it's not Leah Thomas's fault for following the NCAA's rules.
Right. She should not be the target of any attack because she's just because she's successful, she's getting attention. But she's within guidelines. What about the second one?
Yeah, so the second point I talk about is hormone replacement therapy,
Mm-hmm.
which for trans women, they undergo testosterone suppressing therapy. The NCAA's guidelines required it for at least a year
Mm-hmm.
in hormone replacement therapy before trans women could compete on the women's side. And so there's a lot of compelling evidence in the Leah Thomas case alone that indicates that hormone replacement therapy reduces athletic performance to a very significant degree. There was also a really common narrative about Leah Thomas, that pre-transition on the men's side, that she was, the 450th or so best male swimmer in the NCAA. But the media has been seriously misrepresenting
Mm.
Leah Thomas here, because they are not mentioning that she was actually on hormone replacement therapy while competing for the men's team because of the NCAA's guidelines. And so, before hormone replacement therapy, when Thomas was competing on the men's side, she was one of the she was one of the top ranked swimmers in the Ivy League on the men's side. And so after going through the process of hormone replacement therapy, even when her transition wasn't fully complete,
Mm-hmm.
that just shows how much her performance was reduced.
So a lot of the people that are making this argument are saying, oh, she was a mediocre male swimmer and then jumped over. But what they're not realizing is that they're looking at her transition period, where the hormone replacement therapy did what it should do, which is to reduce her ability to compete. She hadn't been doing it long enough, so she couldn't compete as a woman, had to compete with men, and so therefore made it look like she was not so hot, basically, as a male swimmer. And I think that the narrative too is always that we've got these sort of, so male swimmers who say, I know I'm going to compete as a woman, and they're going to just change their clothes one day and suddenly just decide they're going to be a woman. And that is just not at all how it works.
Yeah, I hear this whole narrative about like, oh, you're going to get all of these male athletes who want to take the easy way out and
Right.
transition. And I'm just like, that's not easy. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. But yeah, there is a lot of talk about, these athletes being, cheaters and frauds and all of these really just hurtful things when they're abiding by the NCAA's rules. HRT is substantially reducing their performance. And not only that, but they're putting up with a lot of discrimination and a lot of hatred, both inside and outside the locker rooms. I don't see a lot of privileged male athletes, jumping on board and saying like, yes, I want to be discriminated against just so I can be a top female athlete. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that happening.
And also go ahead and take a full year at least of substandard performance in the group that I have to stay in order to
Right.
then, it's not just jumping from one day to the next.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and not only that, but just like massively change your body's function. Like, i'm
Right.
i'm not a trans person, but I have thyroid issues, and so I can tell you how much hormones affect your overall just your overall experience in life. Like, it can really affect your quality of life. You add in the mental health challenges that trans people face because of discrimination, and it's not a simple thing to do to alter your hormones at all. So it's not an easy way out for male athletes to potentially take in the future.
Right. In the article, you also sort of spell out, you sort of list a couple of other examples of other trans female athletes in the NCAA and what their performance is like. So give us a quick rundown of them.
Yeah, so the first two are Natalie Fahey and Juniper Eastwood. Fahey was also a swimmer, and Eastwood was a track and cross country runner.
Mhm.
And I don't want to go into like a ton of detail about their performances just for the sake of time, but I think that these athletes really highlight an important aspect of the Leah Thomas conversation. Trans athletes have been competing in the NCAA for years, and they've been competing in professional sports as well for decades. And
Mm.
so it's not like trans athletes are necessarily a new phenomenon. It's not like Leah Thomas, is the only trans athlete to ever compete in the NCAA. She is one of the most visible because
Mhm.
she's one of the most successful, but just the presence of other trans athletes, performing pretty average, honestly,
Mhm.
I think is really compelling evidence that trans status alone is not going to increase athletic performances to the extent that people think it will.
Right. Did we want to get into Johanna Harper?
Yeah, she's a really fascinating person. So Joanna Harper, and she's brilliant too, but Joanna Harper is a master's trans runner who not only has experience as a trans athlete, but she also studies trans athletes. And so her anecdotal evidence is also very interesting because she found, that post transition, she was performing just about as well in her age group as a woman as she was as a man. And so she has a very interesting experience there. And she also talks about other trans athletes like Fallon Fox and Meanne Bagger, Renee Richards, who, are these professional athletes that I mentioned a minute ago, who have competed at the highest level of professional sport in their respective sports, and they haven't dominated,
Mm-hmm.
and so this myth that trans athletes are automatically going to be better athletes than cisgendered female athletes
Mm-hmm.
has been proven over and over and over again to be false.
Mm-hmm. And even Leah Thomas this year only dominated in that one event. Her placement in the other events that she competed in, she, was not the winner, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so basically what I think about that, is I was a distance runner in college. And so I ran with men a lot because we didn't compete together, but we practiced together.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran several different events. I ran anywhere from the 1500 to the 10K. And so we would be doing a lot of our workouts together where we would be doing, like mile repeats and, intervals, and we would be doing the same distance, but the guys would just consistently run faster than me, even though I was a very, very good college athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And their race times across the board were also faster than me. And we're just not seeing that with Leah Thomas. Like, she did win her one event, which is fine. She's just a good athlete. But if she really had a distinct biological advantage, she would have absolutely dominated across the board. Because, I mean, when I was running in college, there were guys on the men's team who I think my fastest 10K time was like a 34:30 or something like that. And we would have guys running, I mean, in the 31s, like just obliterating me.
Right.
And so I'm not seeing that same kind of relationship with Leah Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And with me too, it wasn't just my 10K time. It was like they could crush me in the 10K and the 5K and the 1500, just across the board. They were faster than me because they're cisgendered men. I'm a cisgendered woman. They have a performance advantage. Mm-hmm. And that's biology, that's science. And again, that's what hormone replacement therapy is designed to mitigate.
Right. Right. And so they're not the threat that people are trying to make them out to be.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people too, they're conflating trans women with cisgendered men, and they're saying these two people are the same. Yeah. When again, cisgendered men are not undergoing hormone replacement therapy, whereas transgender women are. And so I think that is a really key misunderstanding. And I don't know if it's necessarily a misunderstanding or more so of people wanting to make a point or wanting to, be correct about something. But it's something that I hear people doing a lot.
Right. So the third point, you had kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, just about the harassment and the discrimination and the other things happening outside of practice, basically, for the athletics that impact the performance.
Yeah, and this is where honestly things get really tricky, I think, in the trans athlete discussion, because I think people like to have clear measurables. We like to say, oh, we can track people's testosterone levels on a spreadsheet, and so that's science, and we can like grab onto that data. And that, may or may not be true, but the fact of the matter is there are so many unmeasurables that go into athletic performance, and one of those is mental health. And that's where, discrimination, harassment, hate crimes, and violence come in, because trans people, not just trans athletes, are super, super vulnerable to abuse and discrimination and all kinds of violence, whether it's, verbal or physical. Murders of trans people are very, very common, disproportionately high, is, even in the LGBT population, where people are more actively discriminated against. And so that's going to have an impact on your athletic performance and just your general feeling of being safe in society, not just on the field or in the pool or wherever, but just as a person who's trying to function and do their best in society. And again, that's tricky because it's not like we have measures for mental health status that we really take into account when we talk about athletic performance. But there are studies after studies that show, negative correlations, poor mental health being, correlated with bad athletic performance, and the same vice versa. And so mental health is something that has become more and more visible and more commonly talked about in athletic circles, but it's something that I'm not really seeing being taken into account here.
Right, right. And I got the sense from some of the media accounts that I looked at too, that even within the team, she was not necessarily treated with support across the board from her teammates, which means even during swim practice, there was probably some tension and stress that couldn't have been a positive. Okay, so point number 4.
Yes, so that's the one about biological diversity, because I hear a lot of people talking about, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, how Leah Thomas and just trans athletes in general have this biological advantage because they have experience being athletes in male bodies and they've undergone male puberty and all of that. And that's true. But the fact of the matter is that biological diversity really does exist across all sports and across all athletes. So Michael Phelps is a really common example who's been used in the Leah Thomas discussion. There have been multiple articles written about why Michael Phelps has the perfect body for swimming. He's got webbing in between his fingers, and there's all kinds of physics that go into his kick and things that I'm not an expert in. But he has a biologically very advantageous body for swimming. And then we see this too with, like I use in the article, I talked about Fran Belibe, who is a forward for the Stanford women's basketball team. She is one of the tallest athletes, or she was one of the tallest athletes in the tournament. And she was the only one who dunked in the entire women's March Madness tournament. And so that height, when you have Fran Belibe, who is 6'1", and the average height of a female college basketball player is 5'6", that's a huge biological advantage. And we see that, in the NBA as well, and we have athletes who are well over 7 feet tall. Like that's just, it's not normal to see people who are that tall and who are that just that inclined to be good basketball players. But we really like to see that. We like to see physically domineering athletes in their respective sports. We like to see women dunk, and we like to see these 7 foot tall male basketball players do the same. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that biological diversity really does exist across all sports. And so what worries me about this trans athlete conversation is if we start regulating trans athletes, based on their biology, where does that stop? And I've seen this in some sports already. There have been several Olympics where predominantly Black athletes have been banned for having naturally high testosterone levels. I was a distance runner in college, and I was put on birth control, to make sure that my performances were going to be at a high level. And so we're seeing a lot of regulation specifically of women's bodies in sports already. And so I really worry that if we regulate the bodies of trans athletes, that's going to cause a very slippery slope. And once we start regulating one thing, where does that end? Where do we draw that line? And that's not really a clear answer to me.
Yeah. And I'm thinking the same kind of person who's going to have a strong issue with a trans athlete, maybe the same person to side eye a woman who just has very masculine features and has a high, muscle content in her body, and just and how, if that person's already probably been treated badly for that same reason her whole life, is then questioned and tested about whether she's a real woman or not. And it could just become very messy.
Yeah, and I especially worry about that sort of profiling, because I mean that's what it would be. It would be biological profiling.
Yeah.
I worry about that in the context of these anti-trans sports laws that are popping up, because so many of these laws, they don't have like a clear process to them. So there's one from the state of South Carolina that says if an athlete's gender is disputed, then they can be subject to a quote internal and external genital exam. And my question is, So first of all, let's dissect that a little bit, because first of all, these are bills that are aimed at children.
Yeah.
We're talking about youth athletes, middle school athletes, high school athletes. We're talking about not just trans youth, but cisgendered youth, and only women and girls are going to be impacted by this legislation. So we're talking about regulating women's bodies all the time with, the Roe versus Wade decision being potentially overturned. And this is really extending to kids now in a very, very problematic way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worry that, you have a cisgender girl who just, like you said, has a very high level of muscle, or is, very tall for her age. What if you have a coach from a rival school who says, I don't want her competing, I'm going to dispute her gender? What happens in that situation? And so I have a lot of real worries about how this is going to impact not only female athletes at the college level, but also young girls.
And when I think like the law that just passed in Kentucky that banned all, trans student athletes from performing, and they had to be on with the sex that they are identified at birth. Immediately, I had a friend who got a text from her mom saying, "Oh, I think there's a boy on your daughter's team." And I'm like, "Well, no kidding. It's probably a girl who is a trans boy who is now having to play with other girls, and everyone is going to now be like, what are you doing?" It's creating so many new problems now that are going to just target kids.
Yeah. And I see it being used, like just the whole trans athlete conversation being used for political points so often. Because a lot of these bills, they're drafted by men, first of all.
Yep.
And a lot of people who, weren't college athletes or aren't involved in sports. And so that's a whole other issue that I really take with these bills, is that they're using kids to score political points.
Yeah. Yeah. So our very last point has to do with sort of a broader conversation about fairness in sports.
Yeah, fairness in sports has become somewhat of a buzzword lately. I think a lot of it has to do with trans athletes, but true fairness is a myth at best in sports. And this is something that we as a society don't really want to talk about, because we like to believe that all things are fair and all things are equal. But, at the end of the day, athletic performance comes down to a ton of different factors. It comes down to, I mentioned mental health, socioeconomic status is becoming more and more important in athletes accessing the necessary resources to succeed. Family structure. Like, I was an Army brat. I moved every 2 years. I never had a chance to really be integrated into a team. So things like that. Sleep habits, education, access to athletic facilities and gear. There are so many different structural components to athletic performance. So to say that we need to eliminate trans athletes to ensure fairness, I mean, we're really kind of being cocky when we say that we can ensure true fairness in sports.
Right. It's just, there's so many advantages that some families have that others just don't. Do you have any sort of like final message on this?
Yeah, I would say people who really truly want fairness in women's sports and who want to support women's sports, the way to do that is not to condemn trans athletes on social media. That's not forwarding equity. That's not helping to realize the promise of Title IX at all. There are massive resource discrepancies when we're talking about women's college sports and just women's sports in general, because men's leagues have had decades of a head start on women because women have historically not had access to athletic spaces. So the best way for people to ensure equity in sports and to support female athletes is to actually watch the games, first of all, because it's funny, like when the whole Leah Thomas conversation came up this past spring, I had a lot of people on my timeline and I was like, I had no idea you were such a big women's swimming fan. Like, wow.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's these people who are coming out of the woodworks, who have not watched a women's sporting event at all this past year and who are suddenly demanding equity in sports. And I'm just like, you can be a part of that solution, just watch, if you really love women's swimming, watch women's swimming on a regular basis. The WNBA season tipped off last week. You can buy a league pass and actually support female athletes. The Women's College World Series is coming up this summer. I'm super excited for it. You can watch it on ESPN. Women's MMA, which is something that I like to follow and write about as a freelancer, is available on ESPN Plus. So you can buy a package and, actually support these female athletes that you claim to support so much. Right. So I think it's honestly just like the irony and the hypocrisy of all of this, people coming forward and saying, I support female athletes. And I'm just like, cool, like name 5 of them, name 5 active female athletes, and they can't. So yeah, it's the virtue signaling, I think, that really drives me nuts about this conversation, because in order to realize gender equity in sports, we don't need virtue signaling. We don't need, people pontificating on social media. We need resources, and we need fans, and we need people to, buy merchandise and amplify these voices on social media, and, true fans who actually care about female athletes and not just scoring Facebook points. So I think that would be the last thing that I would have to say about all of that.
Thank you so much for just handing over some of your energy and your expertise on this. I think it means a lot to have this come from somebody who was an actual competitive college level athlete like that. You were right there in it, and you're still in a lot of ways still involved in that world. So just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I think it's a really important topic to talk about. So I appreciate anyone who's giving me a platform.
To read Katie's full blog post, which includes links to the research she references and a link to her book, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 191. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.